Hello and welcome to the Arc Woman podcast. This is an exploration of womankind. Here we discuss what it is to be a woman in the modern world while utilizing ancient and modern modalities in tandem to create a bounty of health for the body, mind and spirit.
G'day everyone and welcome back to the Arc Woman pod. Today we're going to be talking all things ashwagandha, but before we get into it, let's pay our respects to the elders past, present and future residing on the lands of Lutruwita, Tasmania, where I'm recording this podcast today. Always has, always will be, baby. I put this up on my stories and said, what do you want me to do a podcast on? And one of the options was ashwagandha, and I just thought this was going to win by a landslide, and it won by a landslide. This is a very popular herb for good reason. It's pretty great and it's very well suited to our modern world, but there are some important caveats around this, which I think unfortunately a lot of people have learned the hard way. So let's get into all things ashwagandha. So what is ashwagandha? First of all, its botanical name is Withannia somnifera. And it's a part of the nightshade family. So tomatoes, potatoes, chili peppers, which I think it's really interesting. A lot of people who don't really get along with those foods, which tend to have a lot of histamines as well, don't tend to tolerate ashwagandha very well. So if you don't get along with ashwagandha, maybe that's the reason why. If you don't get along with nightshades, because it's a part of the nightshade family. It's a small evergreen shrub, typically under 1.5 meters tall, so just about my height really. Favors dry, stony, disturbed soils in full sun. It's native to Indian subcontinent, but we also see it in the Middle East and parts of North Africa. It's now cultivated from Spain to north central China. So we're seeing it cultivated and grown all throughout the world. It has other common names like Indian ginseng and winter cherry, but botanically unrelated to true ginseng. The ginseng label is marketing shorthand for adaptogenic tonic herb, not a botanical relationship. So the two have completely different phytochemical properties and mechanisms, which is really important for us to correct here. Ginseng is quite warming. I guess ashwagandha, when we talk about Ayurveda, is quite warming as well. That's one of the qualities they have in common. Both of them, to a certain degree, are adaptogenic. I would say ashwagandha is definitely more adaptogenic, but ashwagandha is a calming tonic and ginseng is more upregulating, if you know what I mean, on the nervous system specifically. So there are lots of different parts of ashwagandha that you can use, but we mostly use the root, also known as the mula in Ayurvedic texts. Its leaves, berries, and seeds also appear in some formulations, but mostly we're seeing root and leaf extracts. And alongside that, root and the leaf have completely different purposes underneath Ayurveda. So, and they also have different withanol profiles. A chunk of 2023 and 2024 regulatory confusion stemmed from leaf-derived extracts being marketed under the same ashwagandha umbrella as extracts from the root. So you have to understand when you're buying an ashwagandha, what type of ashwagandha are you taking? Is it the leaf? Is it the berry? Is it the root? Has it been put with alcohol? Does it still have its microbiome on its root structure? There are so many different things that you really need to understand with herbs before you take it. Generally, I think just taking the whole body of the root in a dry form is my preferred way, but we'll get into that later in the podcast. Its primary active compounds is withanolides. So these are a family of 40 steroidal lactones with withanin A and withanode D, with being the most studied. Also contains alkaloids like withane and somnifera and saponins, flavonoids, and trace amino acids as well. Trace amino acids. It is not a good form of protein intake, but it has some amino acids because it's a root. Of course, it's going to have some there. But the most important aspect of ashwagandha, in my opinion, is its steroidal backbone, with withanolides as the single most important fact about the herb. Structurally close enough to our own steroid hormones, cortisol, testosterone, estrogen precursors. If you didn't know, all of our hormones have a cholesterol backbone. That's why cholesterol is so important in our body. That's why all of our cells produce cholesterol. And that's why in periods of stress, your body will increase LDL cholesterol. Why? So your body has more ingredients to make stress hormones like cortisol. And so that's probably one of the reasons why ashwagandha works so well, is because structurally it's very similar to our cholesterol. And because of that reason, the structural composition of these parts of ashwagandha can accidentally have this molecular mimicry with our stress hormones and other hormones in the body, and it can attach to receptor sites, which I think is really interesting. And this is kind of what might underlie both therapeutic effects and the emerging risk profiles associated with this as well. Coming back to that thing that I've said on my podcast a million times, just because it's natural does not mean it's better nor 100% safe, okay? Herbs are very, very strong. They're very powerful. They need to be respected, dosed properly. Just because it's natural doesn't mean that it's not going to hurt anyone and it has no risk profile whatsoever. The fact that it can attach to receptor sites and it has molecular mimicry associated with other sex hormones and other stress hormones like cortisol means that there is risk associated with the dosage and the length that you're taking this herb for. Let's look at its ancient history and traditional use, because it's been used traditionally for thousands of years. It's referenced under the Sanskrit name Asvabhati in the Rig Veda, among the oldest Hindu religious texts dated roughly 1500 to 1000 BCE. And when we look at other classical texts, features extensively in the three foundational Ayurvedic compendia. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that it's really prominent in ancient texts coming out of India associated with the ancient art of eating, Ayurveda. Its etymology is really interesting. So Ashwa means horse and Gandha means smell. So it directly translates to Ashwagandha, horse smell. And so this refers literally to the pungent root odor, and it has a secondary meaning as well. So traditional texts describe the herb as imparting the strength of a horse, framed as a tonic for vigor and resilience, not as a treatment for one disease. So it smells strongly, like horses can sometimes smell quite strongly. Sorry to the horse people out there. Livestock smell sometimes, humans smell sometimes, it's fine. But it's more about how this tonic, this ashwagandha tonic, can give you the strength and the vigilance and the, I guess, vitality of a horse. The Rasayanda classification sits within Ayurveda's Rasayanda category. So herbs associated with rejuvenation, slow age-related decline, and restoring ojas, which is your vital essence and your immunity. Conceptually close to the modern adaptogen framing, supports overall capacity to cope with stresses rather than treating in a single symptom. So even back then, thousands of years ago, people in India understood that this ashwagandha tonic, it had a lot of different effects on the body, and it could improve your immunity, and it seemed to have an adaptogenic effect on the body. Traditionally, it's almost never used as a standalone isolated extract. It's always combined with other herbs, milk, ghee, or honey, which likely altered the absorption and effective dose in ways modern isolated extracts don't and possibly can't replicate either. It's only in modern times, in the past 100 years, where we're actually starting to see ashwagandha used as a standalone treatment. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we're starting to see problems with the emerging safety signals, because now we're seeing is that we're isolating not even just ashwagandha on its own, but we're isolating specific alkaloids and that withanodes in it, and we're only taking that. We're not taking everything else. And hardcore Ayurvedic doctors will say we need to take the root. We need to make sure we're taking it only in winter. We need to make sure that it is taken in a way that we're maintaining the microbiome around it. We can't combine it with alcohol. We need to eat it with certain foods. There is an art to ashwagandha, I think, that modern science has just not caught up with at all. But we will be talking about the modern science today because the compounds in ashwagandha are really, really amazing. But maybe the problems that they're seeing with ashwagandha is the fact that we're taking it alone and we're not taking it in the right way, and perhaps we're not taking it the type of year, etc., etc., etc. So what's ashwagandha's mechanism of action? How does it actually work? So let's start with withanolides and steroid receptor mimicry. I touched on this just before. So withanolides, so that's the compound in ashwagandha that works quite well, that we have lots of research on. They are steroidal lactones, and they share the core 4-ring steroid backbone with cortisol, testosterone, estradiol, and progesterone. Pretty big deal. The structural similarity allows interaction to varying degrees. Okay, we can't swap one out for the other. If you take ashwagandha, it's not going to increase your testosterone or estrogen or whatever. It's a lot more tactile than that, of course, with steroid hormone receptors and the enzymatic machinery regulating steroid synthesis and breakdown. So there are a few different elements of how ashwagandha could potentially interact with each of these systems. And so this is the underlying mechanism of cortisol modulation, thyroid hormone changes, and sex-specific testosterone effects. Ashwagandha should be understood as a hormone pathway active compound, not a simple non-hormonal calming herb. So it does interact with our hormonal system or our endocrine system in a different way depending on your gender, your age, depending on where you are in your cycle, etc. So the first one is your HPA axis and cortisol. I have a whole podcast on cortisol, so you might want to go and listen to that. But when I'm talking about the HPA axis, I'm talking about your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so basically, you feel stressed out, your body perceives such stress, sends something called ACTH to your adrenals go, dope, I'm going to make cortisol. And then we get this active feedback. Have we resolved the stress? Do we feel better? Are we safe? Okay, cool. I'm going to stop releasing ACTH, or I'm going to continue releasing it. So that's the HPA axis, and that has a lot to do with our HPO axis. If we're experiencing a lot of stress, then it can pause the cycle and it can stop you from ovulating as well. So I talk about that on the cortisol podcast. So if you want to learn more about that, there is a whole podcast all about that. The interesting thing about ashwagandha and the HPA axis is that it acts at multiple points. It's direct interaction with glucocortisol receptor signaling and modulation of pituitary ACTH release, with an indirect calming effect on our central nervous system via GABA. So that reduces perceived stress signals reaching the hypothalamus. Okay, so what does that mean in English? If it can modulate the amount of ACTH we release and decrease that, that means we are releasing less cortisol. On top of that, if we're increasing GABA, we're also calming the brain. So there are 2 or 3 different ways that ashwagandha works directly on our central nervous system and that HPA axis. So when people say, oh, if you take ashwagandha, it lowers cortisol, it's not so simple. It interacts with different parts of your brain that generally have a down-regulating nature on our central nervous system. In people with chronically elevated cortisol from ongoing psychological stress, this combination produces a measurable downward shift in serum cortisol, the best replicated effect in the entire literature. So in the entire literature, ashwagandha at this point in time seems to be one of the best contenders for lowering cortisol, which again, coming back to that original point I made at the start of this podcast, makes it perfect for our modern world because we have this chronic stress. We don't live in an ancient world where we have a stressor that's really acute and needs to be dealt with and has very simple resolution, right? The old adage of we're running away from a tiger, for example, or something happens in your community. There is a resolution of that stressor and then you can come back. But whereas now it's, I'm late for work, I haven't had enough food, I haven't slept because my kids are keeping me up all night, and then my boss is pissed off at me, and then, oh, fuck, I forgot to take my supplements and I'm late to hear him. It's just this constant low level of stress that keeps kind of pushing up your cortisol over and over and over again. There is a critical nuance to this though. If we are chronically stressed, ashwagandha works interestingly within this system. In this system, there is a modulation of an already elevated system, not a universal cortisol blocker. So when someone whose HPA axis is already running low, post-burnout with blunted morning cortisol or undiagnosed adrenal insufficiency, further dampening this is a very different proposition. So for me, this is a good example. I've just come out of 2 months of very intense workload. Been working on a website with my amazing website developer, Laura. Shout out to her. Also just finished my PMOS book, hiring an assistant, onboarding them, and a bunch of other things going on the back end of my business. My partner is away at the moment. My dog is a puppy and is doing puppy things like running away. It's been a little bit stressful. And so I'm on my break from ashwagandha. And so I started to take it again for the past 2 or 3 days. And I was like, okay, I can't take this right now because it's too depressing for my system. I started to not feel energized in the morning, really, really tired in the morning, sleeping for 10 hours, still feeling tired after that. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to take it tonight. I'm just going to see how I go. And this morning I feel a lot better. So that's a really good example for you to remember. If you're post a huge period of work or stress and you start taking ashwagandha, you might already have adrenal insufficiency. You might already be post that huge stressor and your body's already starting to do its recovery process. Taking ashwagandha in that instance might not actually be useful and helpful for you. And I'm a good example of that. Going back to how ashwagandha works in the body though. So GABAergic and nervous system effects. So GABA is the primary inhibitory transmitter, the brake pedal that counterbalances excitatory glutamate signaling in our central nervous system. Animal studies show that ashwagandha extracts can act as GABA mimetics, so either binding to GABA receptors directly or potentially GABA signaling. So that's really interesting. It can act as GABA in the brain. And this explains the traditional reputation as a mild sedative and nervine that underpins the modern sleep findings. But there's a practical interaction warning here. Anything else that increases GABAergic tone, so benzodiazepines, Z drugs like alcohol, for example, potential for additive sedation when combined with ashwagandha. So this is rarely discussed. Don't drink with ashwagandha. Don't take a benzodiazepine with ashwagandha. If you're taking sleep medication, don't also take that with ashwagandha because that has too much of a depressing impact on your nervous system, right? So we don't want that. And if your nervous system is already down-regulated in recovery after a period of high stress, so there's no better word to say this, but burnout, that could be harmful as well. So there are huge drug interactions here. You don't want to take too many downers at the same time. Ashwagandha, just because it's a herb and it's natural, does not mean it's inherently safe to take with other pharmaceutical drugs that are designed to down-regulate your central nervous system. Next, let's talk about the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid axis. Again, I have another podcast all about the thyroid with Tara Nelson, who's a naturopath who specializes in the thyroid. Go listen to that if you're more interested in the thyroid. So this is really important. I think a lot of the time we talk about ashwagandha and cortisol, but we don't actually think about how it could possibly impact our thyroid, which is a really important part of our body. If you can't be bothered going and listening to that podcast, I hear you, it's fine. Thyroid basically releases T3 and T4. T3 is active, T4 is inactive, and it sets the metabolic pace of the body. The more T3 and T4 we have around, the warmer you are, the higher your metabolism seems to be, the more energized you are, your brain is functioning well, you have energy, you can exercise, all of these things. If it's too high, you might have trouble sleeping, you might feel really, really anxious. If it's too low, you can get into something called hypothyroidism, low functioning thyroid. Hands and feet are always cold because your metabolism is down-regulated. You might have constipation. You might not be energized. You might have brain fog. You catch me. You follow the drift. Ashwagandha interacts with this system quite dynamically, and it's really important that we take this into account before you take ashwagandha. If you are chronically stressed and you have high cortisol, it blunts T3 and T4. And so that explains that post-burnout tiredness you feel. It's probably from low T3 and T4. So if you're experiencing that, ashwagandha can interact with this. So there's an indirect pathway that ashwagandha can work with your thyroid. So chronically elevated cortisol suppresses T4 to T3 conversion. Remember what I just said? T4 has 4 iodine molecules, and when we take one away, it's T3 and it becomes active and it can work at the receptor site. So when cortisol is around, it stops that conversion from happening. So that's why after a huge period of stress, we feel really, really tired because we don't have that much T3 and T4 around because that conversion has been blunted. Cortisol also blunts TSH, which basically tells the thyroid to make T3 and T4. So we're seeing in 2 different ways, cortisol is blunting our metabolism. If ashwagandha lowers cortisol, this suppression can partially lift, allowing the thyroid axis to speak up again. And there's a more direct pathway here as well. Separately, withanolides, they appear to directly stimulate thyroid hormone secretion and they can increase T4 output or peripheral T3 conversion independent of cortisol changes. Combined, these produce genuine T3, T4 raising and TSH lowering effect in humans, which is not marginal or theoretical. And so that was found out by Sharma et al. In 2018. So that's a really interesting paper to look through. For subclinical hypothyroidism, this could be a potential benefit. For normal thyroid function or critically autoimmune thyroid disease like Hashimoto's or Graves', pushing this already active immune function and dysregulated axis could fuck it up. So basically, if you have any type of autoimmune condition to do with your thyroid, I wouldn't recommend taking ashwagandha unless you're doing it under tight regulation and you are checking in with your health provider, preferably a naturopath or herbalist who knows their shit and has been working with the thyroid for a few years, like Tara Nelson, for example, for a while. I wouldn't just go, okay, I'm going to listen to this. I have a low functioning thyroid. I'm just going to start taking ashwagandha. No, I wouldn't do that. It's not as simple as that. Please contact your health provider for anything to do with your thyroid. What about its effect on testosterone? There is a myth going around that it can increase testosterone in women, which is not true. We've seen that it increases testosterone in men, but it doesn't in women. So let's get into it. The proposed mechanisms in men is its structural similarity with withanolides to testosterone, GABAergic enhancement of hypothalamic GnRH possibility, which increases LH, which pushes forward testosterone production as well. It also reduces oxidative stress in testicular tissue, and the general cortisol lowering effect as well has also improved testosterone output. So ashwagandha is really great for testosterone levels in men if they're teetering a little bit low, and that's a bit of a stressed out individual. This testosterone raising effect has been demonstrated repeatedly in men, but it has not been replicated in women. So in 2026, they concluded ashwagandha does not seem to elevate testosterone in women, unlike in male study groups. And this is really reassuring for women, especially PMOS women, because ashwagandha on paper, you're like, wow, this is actually really perfect for women with PMOS. It lowers oxidative stress, it lowers cortisol, it increases GABA, it improves sleep. This is amazing, but I think there's that fear running through most of these holistic groups that because it increases testosterone in men, it increases testosterone in women. Well, recently, it was very much concluded in this study that it does not, which is a big win for women with PMOS and just generally women overarchingly who don't want to deal with the symptoms of high testosterone. I will also add on to that as well that ashwagandha, from this understanding, makes it really perfect to be used just before and during you going off of any hormone or birth control. So if you're thinking about getting your Mirena taken out in a month and you're thinking, God, I used to have really bad cystic acne and I was a stressed out individual, or I've just had a really stressful few months, or you just also understand that HPA axis can turn online really quite harshly, I would say, in those first months after you going off of hormonal birth control, because remember that HPO and HPA axis have a lot to do with one another. Ashwagandha is pretty great to be taking a month before and a month after you going off of any type of hormonal birth control. I think that's a really great idea. Of course, talk to your health provider as well and make sure you're making a personalized decision. But ashwagandha is really, really great because it can help you to regulate your endocrine system. I'm not saying it can lower testosterone, but it can lower cortisol. And I think that's one of the main things that we really need to keep under control is decreasing oxidative stress, inflammation, and cortisol in that first month or two after going off of hormonal birth control, whatever type of hormonal birth control that is. So let's talk about the research findings organized study by study. And of course, if you want all of the references, they're associated with the ashwagandha article that's on my Substack and my Patreon. So those are both paywalled because this takes a lot of time and effort to research. I'm happy to do it for free on the podcast, but if you want all of the research, you can head over there for the full article and you have all of the references available to you there. So an Indian Journal of Psychological Medicine in 2012, they had 64 adults with chronic stress. They randomized 300 milligrams twice daily of a high concentration of root extract, KSM 66, versus placebo for 60 days. The result was a 27.9 reduction in serum cortisol in comparison with 7.9 in the placebo. So the group that took ashwagandha, we're seeing a 27.9% reduction in serum cortisol compared to the placebo who didn't have any. Another study in 2025, it was a meta-analysis. So meta-analysis are basically going, what are all of the randomized control trials that have already happened? How can we pull all of this data together and make a huge study so we can actually make conclusions and correlations from this work? So they had in that study 873 participants, which is huge, at 8 weeks, and they found significant reductions in anxiety. They also found reductions in perceived stress, serum cortisol as well. So that's really great. Another meta-analysis using 9 trials with doses from 125 to 600 milligrams a day. There's a huge discrepancy in dosage there, I have to say, for 30 to 90 days. Again, huge discrepancy in how long people are on this study for. They found consistent reductions in perceived stress, anxiety, serum cortisol as well. So these really genuine studies that we're seeing in reductions of anxiety and stress. What about sleep? So there's moderate evidence for this, not as strong, I would say, as for perceived stress and cortisol. But it is dose dependent, I have to say. And also alongside this, Ayurveda has been talking about ashwagandha and its benefits for sleep for thousands of years. And I think there is something to say about how we're dosing and the different interactions that ashwagandha has with different parts of the plant alongside that as well. So I will say that I think it's really interesting that we have moderate evidence for ashwagandha in sleep, but we have stronger evidence for something else. And I think it's because of how we're dosing and what parts of the plant that we're using and how we're dosing it and what parts, etc. So in 2021, a study published in PLOS 1, it was a systematic review and meta-analysis of 5 RCTs with a total of 400 participants, with the pooled effect on overall sleep quality being small but significant. So 0.59 with a 95% confidence interval. Pretty good, not bad. Most pronounced in diagnosed insomnia at doses of 600 milligrams a day for 8 weeks. 4 of 5 trials used KSM 6.6. This is real but modest, and the threshold is really dependent. So there's lower doses here, closer to the under 300 mark, and they were unlikely to replicate the sleep benefit. So under 300 milligrams, we're not seeing any benefit for sleep, but over and closer to that 300 to 400 milligrams, we're seeing moderate impacts on sleep. And we're seeing that mostly affecting the groups of people who had insomnia for longer periods of time. What about exercise performance and strength? So I don't think a lot of people think about ashwagandha and its associations with exercise and strength. But remember, ashwagandha, smell of the horse. Ancient Ayurvedic texts have realized this for a really long time, that ashwagandha is associated with improvements in strength and vitality. And we're seeing this represented in the studies here as well. So in 2015, in the Journal of International Society of Sports Nutrition, they took 57 untrained young men. So this might not be applicable to women, unfortunately, in an 8-week resistance training, and they used 300 milligrams twice daily. So that's 600 milligrams a day. So this study, they saw greater increases in one bench press, so one big push of bench press. So if you can imagine the most you can bench press and just doing one rep of that. So they saw improvements in the men's ability to do a higher amount of weight in one rep of a bench press, which is pretty cool. This study also found that leg extension strength also increased, muscle cross-sectional area and serum testosterone all increased as well. So that's a male study, not necessarily applicable to women. You could also argue that the reason why those effects were so pronounced in men is because ashwagandha increases testosterone, and testosterone increases muscle mass in men. So that might not be applicable to women. It'd be cool to see that replicated in women to see if we see the same effect. In a mixed sex 8-week RCT, where they took 600 milligrams a day, improvements in muscle strength, muscle size, VO2 max. One of the few trials included women, though sex stratified strength results were not well reported. So again, guys, why are you not sex aggregating your data? It is 2026. Get it together. This is genuine and strong, but might not be applicable to women, unfortunately. Going back to thyroid function, so Sharma, Basu, and Singer in 2018 in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, one of my favorite journals, I will say, 50 participants with subclinical hypothyroidism, so they had really high TSH and they had lower T3 and T4 output. They took 600 milligrams a day of dry root extract versus placebo for 8 weeks. TSH improved significantly, p-value of 0.001. That's really great. So we saw a reduction in TSH closer to normal, and both T3 and T4 increased significantly from baseline, and T3 specifically increased by an average of 41.5. That is fucking cool. That's really, really great. That's wonderful. So if you're thinking about taking ashwagandha to improve T3, T4, and decrease your TSH, could be great. And there's also an argument for fertility as well, because we know that when TSH is high, T3 and T4 are low, we have pretty poor fertility outcomes because the body just can't access energy and metabolize energy in an efficient way to grow a fetus, which is the most metabolically demanding process of both human beings that we know of, right? So if your body is in that subset of thyroid health, then fertility outcomes will be decreased. So that's why online I did a bit of a doom scroll this morning on ashwagandha, and I saw a bunch of really funny posts of the girlies online saying, you know, the side effect of ashwagandha is that you'll fall pregnant easily. Maybe this is why. I mean, that's anecdotal. That's anecdotal. As I said before, PMOS, previously PCOS, let's talk about it. It's merging and it's largely extrapolated, I will say, of course, because we just don't study women enough. But in 2026 study, it was a narrative review concluding ashwagandha has a strong candidate for supportive treatment for PCOS, PMOS, and PMS, so potentially PMDD as well. I think a lot of women listening to this are taking ashwagandha for their PMDD, and they're saying that it has good effect, and this could possibly be why. And the reasoning is because the HPA axis modulation, it lowers cortisol, it has metabolic effects and GABAergic activity, but explicit that it is relying heavily on preclinical models and extrapolation rather than dedicated trials in diagnosed women with PMOS, PMS, and PMDD. And it also confirms ashwagandha does not appear to elevate testosterone in women. So again, another study confirming that finding. In 2020, in a small pilot study, a 12-week studies report improvement in reproductive hormone markers and HOMA-IR, so insulin-resistant markers in women, although sample sizes are small and not yet replicated at scale. So that's really cool. We love to see a pilot study because it means that there's more interest in replicating it again. Okay, so what about the emerging safety findings? Because at this point in time, ashwagandha has a precarious placement in the EU and a few other countries across the world. Let's get into it. So the first one is liver injury, hepatotoxicity. So Philips Liver Research Club India et al. In 2023, they published in Hepatology Communications. There were case series of 8 liver injuries attributed to a single ingredient ashwagandha product of 23 of total internationally reported cases, and predominantly cholesterostatic hepatitis pattern, male predominance. So the onset of liver toxicity that we're seeing in these people using a single ingredient ashwagandha product. So it's basically saying if we know it was the ashwagandha, we're seeing risks associated with this. And we've seen 23 cases reported total. So there's going to be a lot more than that. Typically, we're seeing these symptoms of liver injury within 2 to 12 weeks of starting supplementation. And there's rare cases of acute liver failure requiring transplantation and have been reported internationally. So that's really quite scary. The proposed mechanism here is withanolides bind to hepatocyte proteins and DNA, forming adducts, and deplete glutathione, which is the liver's primary intracellular antioxidant and detox cofactor. So if we don't have glutathione around, reactive oxygen species, also known as ROS, can basically rip around the liver and cause a lot of damage, and the liver can't heal itself and it becomes more of a toxic environment. Depleted glutathione leaves the liver more vulnerable to oxidative injury, and it may explain why we're seeing all these cases possibly linked to individual variation of glutathione S transferase polymorphisms, aka we're seeing structural damage in DNA and the protein. TGA Safety Advisory in Australia in the 22nd of February of 2024, so only 2 years ago, 12 reports of liver problems in Withania consumers, 7 assessed as likely liver injuries, and 4 requiring hospitalization with no contributing ingredients identified. Separately, 16 hospitalizations linked to severe GI reactions like nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. That might be the nightshade interaction that I was talking about earlier. And some of these were after a single dose. Some of them were taken for long periods of time, and some of them weren't as well. So that's pretty scary and should be very concerning to all of us. And I think that really speaks to that just because it's natural doesn't mean it's necessarily safe. And if you have been taking ashwagandha for a while and you're noticing some symptoms that you don't like, please stop taking it and talk to a health provider before you continue. Alongside liver injury, we're also seeing HPA axis suppression and Cushingoid presentations. The 2026 case report is here. So in 2026 endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism case reports, in this case report, they had a 55-year-old postmenopausal woman with progressive weight gain and Cushingoid features, which is a moon face in a way. Remember how everyone was talking about cortisol face for a while, and I made a few posts about, hey, that's Cushing's disease. That's a very different thing. If you have a moon face, please contact your provider. Don't buy a cortisol kit because that can't be treated at home kind of thing. This is kind of what I'm talking about here. So the history of this woman was 950 milligrams of ashwagandha across 3 syrups, 2 tablet formations, and are prescribed for knee osteoarthritis continuous for over a year. Crazy. That's a huge dose. And you're taking it in different ways that can increase the bioavailability in your body, and you're taking it with no breaks throughout a year. That's the reason why this happened, is because this woman was told and she believed that it's natural, therefore it's not dangerous. Big mistake. Big no bueno. The endocrine workup was early morning cortisol being 0.5, ACTH in low normal, which was 16 pg per milligrams, and a blunted cortisol response in the morning at 2.89 and 3.68 at 60 minutes. So 2.89 within 30 minutes of waking up and 3.68 within 60 minutes of waking up, which is diagnostic of secondary adrenal insufficiency. What does that mean? You're supposed to have your largest amount of cortisol first thing in the morning. So within 30 minutes, it should be halfway up to its max. And then within 60 minutes, it should be all the way up. But that's why we say don't drink caffeine within that first 60 minutes of you waking up, because it can stop that process. And the cortisol that your body gives you first thing in the morning to be active and awake is far stronger than any caffeine you could have. So this woman had really, really, really low cortisol. So ashwagandha was blunting her cortisol to a point where it was negatively impacting her circadian rhythm, which governs everything in the body, which is very, very concerning. They also found subclinical hypothyroidism. Her TSH was at 7.19. That is just, I've never seen anyone with a TSH of 7.9. That is crazy. With positive anti-TPO antibodies underlying autoimmune thyroid disease and new onset diabetes, with her HbA1c at 6.5%. She started on hydrocortisone at 3 months. Her HbA suppression had not reversed. At 6 months, her basal cortisol remained suppressed at 0.48. That's pretty staggering. Okay. And this is a really good case study for you to understand that overdoing ashwagandha has really huge negative health consequences that you should take very seriously. It's really important to understand also this patient had pre-existing undiagnosed autoimmune thyroid disease, and it raises the possibility that people with underlying endocrine vulnerabilities like thyroid autoimmunity specifically may be at a disproportionate risk, which is why, yes, okay, if you have Hashimoto's and your T3 and T4 are low and your TPO is a little bit high and also your TSH is through the roof, okay, ashwagandha on paper sounds like it's going to be great, but ashwagandha does tend to upregulate our immune system, and therefore we can make more and more and more of these antibodies. So if you have any type of autoimmunity, be very, very careful with the type of herbs that you're taking and make sure you're talking about this with your health provider. So understandably, there has been an international response. So Denmark banned ashwagandha in 2023. They prohibited it in food and supplements based on a 2020 Danish Technical University DTU risk assessment, citing thyroid and sex hormone effects and referencing historical contested abortifacient data. So does it cause abortions? We don't know, but there is some data to suggest it that has been contested. But Denmark still banned it based on that. In France, the ANSWERS advisory in 2024 advised people with thyroid, liver, cardiovascular conditions, hyperandrogenism, pregnant women, and those on sedatives to avoid ashwagandha. The European Union in Article 8 procedure recommended of June 2024, the heads of Food Safety Agencies Working Group recommended an Article 8 procedure under Regulation EC number 1925-2006. They can lead the EU-wide restrictions, citing reproductive effects, thyroid hormone changes, and immune effects and liver toxicity. In Australia, my stomping ground, the TGA is looking into this ongoing. So the TGA also, no hate to the TGA, but you guys take a really long time to do stuff. Why you be taking so long? Anyway, safety advisories are issued on ashwagandha. No mandated liver injury warnings label yet on withania containing listed medicines. Further regulatory action is possible as evidence accumulates, which is really shocking because an Australian woman was in that case study. So here's the counter view that comes from India. So an Indian regulatory industry body argues that some risk assessments conflated leaf extract data with root extract data, which have different safety profiles, and that historical abortifacient claims rest on older, poorly sourced references. The honest framing for listeners here is case reports and hospitalization data are real and recent. Regulatory responses are still ongoing and contested. So we need to understand this a little bit more. And this goes back to another point. I've been circling back a lot in this podcast. How we're using ashwagandha is very different from how historically I think we have. And I think we got to go back to the root. So all of that done, who is this for? So reasonable candidates, let's talk about it. Otherwise, healthy adults experiencing chronic psychological stress with normal baseline thyroid and adrenal function. People with stress-related sleep disturbances, particularly at 600 milligrams a day for standardized extract, underneath personalized guidance of a naturopath, someone who understands herbs, or a health provider, okay? Always doing the higher doses under the guidance of someone who knows what they're doing. Individuals with confirmed subclinical hypothyroidism that don't have high anti-TPO antibodies, okay? Men diagnosed with low sperm count and low fertility and generally low testosterone as well. Really strong candidates, okay? Also underneath that, possibly PMOS, possibly PMDD, and possibly PMS as well. So premenstrual syndrome, not PMDD. Really strong candidates based on our theoretical understandings of how this plant works. Okay, so who avoids ashwagandha? Pregnancy and breastfeeding. You knew it was coming. I'm really sorry. historical, though contested abortifacient associations, plus the general principle of avoiding hormonally active steroidal compounds in pregnancy without robust safety data. So it's the same thing again. We just don't have a lot of data, and no one wants to do the risky thing of doing a randomized control trial on women because the risk is too high. It's possibly very, very unethical to run those studies. So that's very hard for us to find out if it is ever going to be safe. I will also say as well, it might mess up your autoimmunity. It might also mess up your immunity, and your immunity changes a lot throughout pregnancy and the relationship with the growing fetus. So you really don't want to risk it from that perspective as well. Autoimmune thyroid disease, so Hashimoto's and Graves'. Hashimoto's is hypothyroidism, Graves' is hyperthyroidism. Direct thyroid stimulating effects exacerbate the already dysregulated thyroid axis. Acute liver disease and history of liver injury, documented by hepatotoxicity case injuries and the glutathione depletion mechanism. And we need to look to the TGA compliance as well. Even though they're really slow, we need to make sure in Australia we're looking at that. Hyperthyroidism, so direct thyroid stimulating reasons, so it can upregulate thyroid production, so T3 and T4, and it can downregulate your TSH. So that's why. And other autoimmune conditions, immune modulating and mood stimulating properties could theoretically aggravate autoimmune activities. Just generally, if you have an autoimmune condition, I would be very careful, if not avoid ashwagandha altogether. There are better herbs that you can be taking. We will be talking about them in due time on this podcast. Alongside that as well, if you have pre-existing adrenal insufficiency or HPA axis dysfunction, if you're burnt out, if you have a prolonged high use of corticosteroid use, in that 2026 case report suggests that this population may be at disproportionate risk of further HPA suppression. So remember, ashwagandha is a down regulator on your HPA system. If you're post-burnout, it might not be the best thing for you to be taking right now. Also, if you're taking other drugs, so thyroid medication, sedatives, benzodiazepines, and other CNS depressants, GABAergic mechanism medications as well. Also diabetes medication, so insulin, metformin, wouldn't take ashwagandha alongside that. Antihypertensive medication as well, because theoretically ashwagandha can impact blood pressure lowering effects, and so we don't want to double down on that. Also immunosuppressant medication, because ashwagandha stimulates your immune system. So if you're taking immunosuppressants for because you have an autoimmune condition and then you take ashwagandha to upregulate it, you might just be wasting your money in two different directions and then causing your body a whole lot of havoc as well. Okay, so what's the practical diet guide? What's the dosing? What part of the plant should we be using? So standardized extracts, not all ashwagandha is the same product. So there are 3 or 4 different types that you'll see. So number 1 is your KSM66. So that's the root only full spectrum extract with 5% withanolides, and it has a low temperature solvent-free extraction, and it's by far the best studied extract used in most of these cortisol studies, used in most of the testosterone studies in men as well. So the typical dosing is 600 milligrams twice daily, so 600 milligrams a day total. But I would say if you're in that safe group and you're working with someone, just start with 300 milligrams, okay? You don't have to go straight for the 600. I think a lot of us in the modern world are quite extreme. I think just start low, titrate low with herbs always, and then slowly work your way up. Because if you get a really good effect at 300 milligrams, that's great. You're saving money, you're using less, and you've already found a titration that works well for your body. Also, another type of extract is Notrium, also known as Sensoril. That's a root and leaf extract. It has 10% withanolides, and it has a lower absolute dose, so 125 to 250 milligrams a day, because it has double the amount of withanolides in it. So we want to use a little bit less. Anecdotally, these are far more sedating than KSM66, possibly related to the leaf component. So that's what those Indian regulatory bodies were talking about was, yes, you can write these case reports. Yes, we should use ashwagandha safely, but what part of the plant are you using? Because they both have different effects on the body. And so that's where Sensoril kind of comes in. So you could take a lower dose and take it closer to bedtime, and you could use that as a possible sedator to fall asleep easier as well. There's also Shodan, which is the root and leaf extract, and it has a really, really, really high withanol concentration at 35%, allowing much lower doses at 120 to 240 milligrams a day. Even that I probably would even be taking. I would probably only be taking like 50 milligrams a day of that because it's so strong, and I wouldn't be taking it in the day, girl. No. Be taking that one at night for sure. Key takeaway here is, yeah, you can focus on how many milligrams it is, but what extract is it? How was it extracted? Is the leaf in there? Is there root? Also, alongside that, is it organic? Because hardcore Ayurveda nuts will also tell you the microbiome on the root interacts with how it helps you understand and meld with that herb. So I would always go organic root extract. That's what I've used previously, and I've really liked it. I've used the alcohol or glycerin based extracts as well, and I don't know, I just haven't felt any huge benefit with them personally, but that's just me. That's totally anecdotal. Okay, so let's dose based on goal. So stress, anxiety, and cortisol. Most of the data we have shows 300 milligrams twice daily, so 600 milligrams a day of KSM-66 type extracts for at least 8 weeks before assessing effect. Sleep is 600 milligrams a day sustained for at least 8 weeks. Lower doses unlikely to replicate meta-analysis findings, and also different extracts, right? So you don't really want to be using that root extract for sleep because you could be using that leaf and root extract together and taking it closer to bedtime, and because it has a higher amount of withanol extract in it, and that could help you sleep. And also the sleep data we have suggests that sleep benefits are only in those who have previously had insomnia. So look into that data. Subclinical hypothyroidism, again, under supervision. 600 milligrams a day root extract for 8 weeks. So that's the Sharma 2018 protocol, and repeat thyroid panels at this point. And general exploratory use, you can start at 300 milligrams a day and titrate up after 1 to 2 weeks to assess tolerance, possibly GI, because it's part of the nightshade family. You might not like the nightshade family before reaching a full dose. And if you're just using it to use it, if you're like, oh, okay, I have my exams, I'm going to use it over that period of time. I'm going to start taking it for 2 weeks before that, so I stay cool, calm, and collected. That's great. If you are trying to take it after a period of time where you're stressed, I would wait a little bit until you kind of come back to a normal regulation, nervous system regulation, before you introduce it, for example. Timing and cycling. This is also really important. You can't just stay on ashwagandha forever. You have to go off and on. So cycling is typically 8 to 12 weeks on, 2 to 4 weeks off. If you're on it for 12 weeks, don't just go off it for 2 weeks, okay? If you're on it for 12 weeks, you need to take a whole month off. If you're on it for 8 weeks, you need to take at least 2 weeks off, okay? You can't just go maximum and minimum with this. It doesn't work that way. I will also say that cycling is not directly evidence-based. That no trial has tested cycled versus continuous dosing, but essentially all the efficiency trials run for 8 to 12 weeks, and the 2026 case report involved continuous use for over a year. So cycling is a reasonable precaution pending better long-term data. Okay, so how can I find a good ashwagandha product? So choose a product naming with its standardized extract at KSM-66. It should also say whether it's sensorial, Shodan, or equivalent. And it also should have a stated withanolide percentage, not just ashwagandha root powder. That's just like the berberine podcast we did last time. If it just says berberine root powder, what does that mean? Because berberine has so many different sources. Ashwagandha has so many different ways that you could be taking it. And you want to be making sure you're taking the right extract for the right purpose, underneath the right dosage, for the right amount of time. Look for third-party testing, particularly heavy metals. Ayurvedic herbal products from certain regions have been documented historically of contamination of lead, mercury, and arsenic in some batches. Yes, it's really amazing to want to support Indian companies because this is where it's from. You know, you want to honor that, but also make sure that if you're buying it from that region, that it's third-party tested, okay? If you want to know about the one that I take, I have an iHerb, and I pop up all of the supplements that I take there. I think iHerb gets a lot of shit. Some of the supplements on there really, really suck, but I think if you're trying to save money and you want 10% off, you can click the link in this podcast bio and you can get 10% off your first order of ashwagandha. And I personally use the ashwagandha that I have on my iHerb as well. So go ahead and use that underneath the very strict guidance of a health practitioner. Okay. And remember, if you want any of the references for this podcast, head over to my Substack and Patreon, and you can find the ashwagandha article that goes with this podcast with all of the references written there. And you can also read the article, which is really interesting. And I've written down everything and more that I've talked about here on this podcast today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to listen to this episode. If you loved it, please remember to like, subscribe, and send to a loved one. If you want to learn more from ARC Woman, please check out the website at arcwoman.com.au, where you can find a plethora of offerings like charts, masterclasses, courses, and organic clothing. You can also head over to patreon.com/arcwoman or substack.com/arcwoman to join the community. I hope you have a really beautiful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the world, and I will see you on the next episode.